class, welcome to more later 20th century and contemporary literature. Yes, we are studying more, of course, about our authors, our women authors from more modern times, that of the later 20th century and contemporary literature. So the later 20th century and into our 21st century now. Of course, we have an explosion of women writers because women now, of course, can be educated. They learn to read and write. They attend colleges. They can have jobs. There's not the kind of discrimination that women received during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and even into the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, or even the early 1900s. Many women write under their own names. In fact, most women do, although there are still some that take pen names, like J.K. Rowling. She took the pen name of her initials, J.K., because she thought that people would be more likely to read a book about a boy wizard if they didn't necessarily know it was written by a woman. So we still have instances of that. But far more women are writing under their own names now. And of course, the printing press has enabled publication of works to become so cheap and so widely accessible that we have a gigantic reading population as well as writers to feed them or meet their needs. All right, so on to the authors we're studying this week. We're going to first start off with Octavia Butler, and the piece of hers that we read this week is Bloodchild. It's a short story, and it's also science fiction. So that'll be a change. Of course, we read some science fiction earlier by Mary Shelley in the 1800s, and now we move up to modern times with contemporary literature and a short story that is science fiction from our own uh, times here. If you look at the printed out lecture, there's a lovely photo of Octavia Butler. And of course, links to more biographical and literary information if you'd like to know more about Octavia Butler, her life, her writings, or the work of hers that we read this week. There's an obituary published for Octavia Butler through one of the links upon her untimely death. Yeah, it was sad. We'll more into that in a little bit. There's some YouTube links to watch a two-part Charlie Rose interview with Octavia Butler, and several NPR tributes to Octavia Butler upon her unexpected death, and they bring up some older pieces too to honor her when she died. There's an essay on racism that she wrote, a piece on Octavia Butler's lasting impact, a Fresh Air interview where Terry Gross, the host of Fresh Air, interviews Octavia Butler. Terry Gross is a very famous interviewer, so it's really fun to listen to her interview Octavia Butler. And a piece on visionary fiction, Butler's idea on fiction as visionary, on the NPR show It's Been a Minute. Now, Octavia Butler is an American. She lived from 1947 till 2006, so into the 21st century. She only lived till about 58 years old, which is kind of sad because she died tragically, accidentally, when she left her house and didn't get too far from it, and she slipped on a cobbled path. And that was outside her house in Lake Forest, Washington. So it was cold, and she slipped on some ice. The ice was on the path, and that's why she slipped. And also at that time, she was suffering from high blood pressure and heart problems where she couldn't take but a few steps without having to stop and breathe heavily. So I think that compounded matters when she slipped and fell as well. And her high blood pressure medication depressed her during her later years and may have contributed to ensuing writer's block that she had during that time. But she still, throughout that time, continued to teach at the Clarion science fiction writers' workshop that had been so formative for her in her younger years. Octavia Butler was born and raised in Pasadena, California by her mother, who worked as a maid to support the family because her father, who worked as a shoe shiner, had died early on. Now, when Octavia was only 9 years old, she had seen a bad science fiction movie, the 1954 Devil Girl from Mars, and she thought when she saw that movie, geez, I could write a better story than that. And somebody got paid for writing that story. So from that time on, Octavia decided to become a writer because she thought that she could think of a better story than the movies. She even begged her mother for a Remington typewriter. So her mom saved the money and got it for her so that Octavia could start writing. Despite Octavia Butler's aunt Hazel telling her, honey, Negroes can't be writers. So Octavia was undeterred. She realized that women could earn money from writing, that writers could support themselves through writing. And she thought, I can think of better stories than what I'm seeing, so why wouldn't somebody pay me? Um, Undaunted, Octavia studied at Pasadena City College, at California State, at Los Angeles, where she won a school-wide short story contest. She even attended the minority mentorship program called the Open Door Workshop of the Writers Guild of America West, where she met famous science fiction writer Harlan Ellison. You may have heard of him if you read science fiction. He's quite famous. He was so impressed with Octavia Butler's writing that he gave her $100 for her to apply to the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, the same one that I told you she continued to teach at later on in life. Now, her mother gave Octavia the equivalent of a month's rent for Octavia to attend once Octavia had gotten accepted. And there, at that writer's workshop, Octavia sold 2 short stories, one of which Harlan Ellison himself bought and published in a 1971 short story anthology. So she really got her start, you know, once she met Harlan Ellison and got connected with this writer's workshop and started learning on how to improve her craft, and actually met with people who bought and published her writing. Octavia was unable to publish another piece, however, until 5 years later, when she published her first book called Pattern Master, which she had precociously conceived at the age of 12. I'll tell you, those juices were percolating after she saw those bad movies and she thought, I can do better than this. And so she started dreaming up her stories. Octavia was a pioneer in the science fiction world. She was one of the first African American female writers ever to write science fiction. She encouraged women to write without resorting to the conventional obscuring initials or male or androgynous pseudonyms. So she used her own name. Octavia used science fiction to provide the metaphors through which she commented on race, gender, war, science, politics, religion, and other hot button sociological issues. For instance, her 1979 novel Kindred used time travel to move a contemporary female African American back to slavery times. Octavia published her her last novel called Fledgling in 2005. The novel reimagines vampires living in a symbiotic relationship with humans. In keeping with Octavia's use of science fiction to explore and challenge traditional notions of gender, race, and politics, the novel's protagonist, a diminutive black girl of a hybrid vampire race called the Aina, upends the stereotypical white male vampire genre. So, there you go. She changed many things in science fiction, in addition to becoming a science fiction pioneer herself as one of the very first Black female science fiction writers. Now, of course, remember the very first, or acknowledged by many as the very first English writing science fiction author, was our own Mary Shelley, who we read in the early 1800s. And now here we are coming full circle with Octavia Butler in the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, Octavia Butler never married. She said she was a happy hermit. Quote, and this is Greg Bear who's saying this about Octavia Butler. He says, mostly she just loved sitting down and writing. For being a Black female growing up in Los Angeles in the 60s, she was attracted to science fiction for the same reasons I was. It liberated her, unquote. Now, Jane Jewell, executive director of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, called Octavia Butler, quote, one of the first and one of the best to discuss gender and race in science fiction, unquote. Octavia Butler was the first science fiction writer ever to receive the coveted Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation. She also won the prestigious Hugo and Nebula Awards several times, including a Hugo and a Nebula Award, both for the curious short story of hers that we read for class, the science fiction work called Bloodchild, which she published in 1984. All right, I turn you over to the anthology to read more about Octavia Butler's life and to read that short story, Bloodchild. Enjoy!